Jason Crawford. Welcome to Flies in the Ointment podcast. Jason, you gave a talk last year about nuclear energy, which is a topic that I am very passionate about. And let me just say a few words about Jason Crawford. Jason Crawford actually started as a computer scientist, correct?
Yeah, my background's in computer science, and I was a software engineer, engineering manager, and a tech startup founder. Yeah.
And dare I say, somehow you became enamored with the science of progress?
Yeah, definitely, and the history of it. So I got very interested in the history of technology and of technological progress, and more broadly of human progress. In early 2017, I started a blog called The Roots of Progress, and then in late 2019, I became my full-time job. I became an independent researcher, and that's where I am today.
So, why the history of technology?
Well, uh, technology is behind one of the greatest things ever to happen to the human race, which is the enormous explosion in material living standards over the last couple of hundred years. I think that Deirdre McCluskey calls it the great enrichment, right? And I think it deserves that term.
Yeah.
So, I think if you care about human life and well being and our capabilities on this planet, then you just have to look at what happened over the last couple hundred years, which is absolutely unprecedented in history, right? For almost all of human history, you had sort of per capita wealth, barely increasing or not really increasing at all. And then, the last couple hundred years, it's gone up 20 or 30 times in developed countries, maybe even more by some measures. So, if you care about human well-being, I think you have to look at that and be somewhat in awe and say, wow, first off, how did it happen? Like literally just what were the key discoveries and inventions, right? What were the steps? Second, why did it take so long, right? Why were there so many thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years of human history before that really got going? And then, for the future, how can we keep this going? It seems like a really good thing. How can we keep it going and maybe even speed it up? So those were the questions that I was motivated by that, began me on this study.
What is the biggest hindrance in the technological progress as you have been able to zoom it into a particular thing?
Yeah, wow. Well, let's see. So it might be different if you ask over sort of the course of human history versus today, although there's definitely some overlap. I mean, over the course of human history, I think there's a number of things. I think about the pace of progress is determined by really there's a number of overlapping feedback loops. So progress compounds. It feeds on itself. Progress begets progress. It allows us to make more progress. And this is true at multiple levels. So technology itself, when it's fundamental enough, can help us create more technology. For instance, precision machining, precision manufacturing, which really developed around the 1800s, is a fundamental enabling technology that enables many other types of machines. Just generally at an economic level, the more wealth that we create, the more surplus we can accumulate, and the more we can then put back into R&D, which then allows us to continue making more progress, right? Science and technology overlap this way, or feedback have a feedback cycle, right? So science enables advanced technology, and then technology can create instruments or other things that enable us to make more progress in science. And I think it's also true at the level of philosophy and sort of cultural attitudes. The more people believe in progress, believe that it's both possible and desirable, the more that they are inclined to go out and try to make progress, and then the more of it actually happens. And I think that was actually a pretty big driver. So Joel Mokyr, the economic historian, especially in his book A Culture of Growth, argues this, that in most times and places, people didn't even have the idea of progress itself, the idea that it was possible and desirable. This thesis might have been first articulated in a pretty well-known work from the 1920 by Berry called "The Idea of Progress," and both of them, Berry and Mokyr, argue that essentially the very notion of progress sort of emerged in the West, in Europe, around the time of Francis Bacon and his contemporaries. The idea that not only could we move science forward and gain new knowledge through the experimental method, but also that this would be useful, that it would lead to useful improvements that would improve arts and manufactures. That was something that, for instance, the ancient Greeks and Romans, they might have thought about advancing our knowledge and advancing science, but they had no idea how much that could then come back and actually be useful for economics and for wealth and living standards. So it's really just the last few hundred years, maybe 500 years or so, that we've even had, that basic idea that that was possible.
Yeah. One of the underappreciated aspects of technology is that this conversation is only made possible because we have a surplus of time that we're not devoting to trying to figure out how much food we can actually get and, build a shelter and all of these basic needs. They've been so well satisfied because of the technological progress that we have a surplus, a leisure that allowed our brain to have time to think about philosophical issues,
Yeah.
this being one of them.
Just as an example, so I mean, before the Industrial Revolution was applied to agriculture, before it was mechanized and we had fertilizer, and so forth, about half of the population had to be farmers just to keep the other half
Mm-hmm.
alive. A farm family could feed roughly themselves and one other family. And so just half your workforce right there is in agriculture. That doesn't leave a whole lot left over. And of course, most of the rest were making basic necessities, right? Clothing and some blacksmithing and pottery and glass blowing and so forth. There just wasn't a whole lot left for university professors
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
writers and researchers and scientists and inventors and so forth.
So there is a trade-off that comes with technology. And the trade off being with technological progress, we have this surplus, we can allocate more of our time to having philosophical conversations, thinking about the scientific process itself, thinking about how much we can allocate to R&D so we can actually leap to the next technological stage. But there is no technology that comes without costs, right? Technology displaces. Joseph Schumpeter called that the creative destruction. But generally we say, okay, as long as the net is positive, then we take on that cost. But there are also other risks that come with technologies. Those risks can be sufficiently so to make the net benefit negative, or they could keep it positive and we take on those risks. So let's talk about energy, for example, the topic of nuclear energy in particular. Every technology, and you talk about like the bicycle, and this, what seems to be a very simple tool that we all enjoy, actually, the technology behind it wasn't intuitive at all. There are complexities that we fail to appreciate. And sometimes with the bicycle, most people are not worried about the bicycle being a risk. But with nuclear energy, for example, there are, we associate nuclear with a nuclear bomb, but the nuclear energy is still far safer than, and we can talk about that, than even generating energy via fossil fuels. But there is a mystery to nuclear energy, and when people don't understand the mystery, they tend to overemphasize the risk over the benefits. Can we talk a little bit about nuclear energy?
Yeah, sure. Um, I do think it is to understand the history of nuclear energy. I do think it is significant and and deeply unfortunate in many ways that nuclear technology made its introduction to the world as a horrible weapon.
Yes.
That a very dramatic and a deadly and destructive weapon. And so from the very beginning, nuclear technology, I think, was associated in the public mind with death and
Mm-hmm.
horror, in a way that was hard to completely undo. And I do think that's unfortunate, and it seems like one of those quirks of
Mm-hmm.
history, right? You just wonder how things might have gone differently if if World War II had never happened, or if nuclear technology had been developed before or after it. But this is the timeline we're living in. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that's very important. Radiation itself is also it's a mysterious force, right? It's invisible.
Mm-hmm.
When radiation was first discovered in the form of X-rays in the very late 1800s, um, people at first didn't think that it could possibly be harmful. I mean, nobody had a clue that it could be harmful. And the very early X-ray machines, often were treated as novelties. Somebody would set up an X-ray machine at a carnival or a birthday party or something, right? And people would just X-ray their hands for fun, right? See your bones. It was like a cool, kind of thing that you could do. The X-ray operators themselves actually had it worst of all because they would regularly use their hand as a test to make sure the machine was working. Nobody had any shielding or any notion of dosage. Now, within the first, I don't remember exactly how long, year or two of this stuff going on, people started to realize that there were harmful effects. But at first, people will look, you can't see it, smell it, feel it. You can't even feel it going through you. It doesn't even warm you up, or there's no tingling or anything. How could anything that you can barely detect possibly harm you? But then they found out it could. They used to, you'd get hair falling out when X-rays had been done to the side of the head, or you'd get skin burns and things like that, and eventually cancers. And so that was shocking to people who who had been experimenting with it. And of course, we evolved safety standards for X-rays and so forth. But I think it just points to radiation being this kind of mysterious force where you can't see it or detect it in any way without a special instrument, and yet it causes some strange a potential harm inside the body that might not even show up right away and might show up hours, days, or years later, right, in the case of a cancer.
Mm-hmm. And so, given those, so where do you draw the line? How much risk can we take with nuclear energy?
Well, by now, I think we understand, or ought to understand, the health effects of radiation enough to be able to avoid them. I mean, certainly in 1895 we did not, but now more than 100 years later, right? We have a lot of science. We understand much better the mechanisms of how radiation affects DNA. We hadn't even discovered DNA in 1895, right? So we just have a whole lot more information now to know, sort of where is a reasonable threshold. I mean, and the problem, as I gather that you've maybe covered in previous episodes, is that we've adopted this model of radiation damage, the linear no threshold model, or LNT, that that basically doesn't recognize any safe level of radiation. And now, I'm not an expert in this, but to my understanding, the LNT model of radiation damage doesn't really comport either with theory or with evidence of radiation damage, right? So, in theory, again, I'm just summarizing my basic understanding here, but in theory, what happens is that radiation is breaking DNA strands, and so it's actually causing damage to DNA. But the cell has certain repair mechanisms for DNA, and if the rate of breakage is below some threshold, then the repair mechanisms can do a pretty good job. And in fact, indeed, this is happening all the time at a very low level. And it's only once the rate of breakage exceeds some threshold that the repair mechanisms can't keep up, and that's where you get DNA damage, and that can ultimately lead to cancers and so forth. And then, I mean, the evidence, there's a whole lot of, there's been many different studies. There's been studies on the Hiroshima survivors, studies on the women who used to paint radioactive clock dials and other, things with the glow-in-the-dark paint. There's been a number of, there was one episode where an apartment building was accidentally built with steel rebar that I think had some radioactive cobalt in it, and so the people in the apartment building were exposed to some level of radiation for a while before anybody figured out what was going on. And then, of course, you can also look at the natural background level of radiation. Many people, I suppose, don't know this, but the level of radiation that we're all exposed to every single day, no matter what, is not zero. There actually is some natural background radiation. I don't remember all the sources. I mean, I think some of it comes from cosmic rays, literally coming in from space. Some of it is from rocks and minerals around us. And in some parts of the world, this is significantly higher than in other places. So there are certain countries and certain specific cities and beaches, areas and so forth, where some beaches where the sand has, some higher level of kind of naturally radioactive substances and so forth. So these populations have all been studied. Um, and my understanding, I think these studies are controversial and different people interpret them in different ways. But what I've read seems to indicate that the linear model doesn't hold up. That it is not strictly linear, and that at lower levels of radiation, the harm is actually reduced by orders of magnitude below what the linear model would predict.
And not only that, it's actually even the harm is even below control groups, as some of the clinical studies have found, not only just the clinical studies and the epi studies as well. And that's basically that new model that was not really new, but when you look at the history of science, this model is ancient. But the hormetic model, the idea that a low level of stress may give you more resilience to combat higher level of stress of the same substance, and in fact more substances. So you could be exposed to a small level of radiation and you develop resilience to higher doses of radiation, but perhaps other substances that may induce harm. And so this idea in toxicology that the dose makes the poison is so ancient. It captures the neutrality aspect. In other words, your body takes care of harm when the exposure is very at small levels. Beyond that, yes, the harm may become significant, but your body takes care of, and that's like the idea of the cells have an adaptive response and they repair. But it doesn't capture the idea of hormesis, which is very counterintuitive, and generally people don't like to think about there it might be a hormetic effect to something as scary as radiation, that you might even do better being exposed than even a control group that's never been exposed. So
Yeah.
in terms of this concept of better be safe than sorry, how much is that costing us when it comes to nuclear energy?
Well, I don't know how to quantify it, but I do think that it does seem that actually, let me give a little bit more context. So, partially on the basis of this linear no threshold model, the nuclear regulation in the United States has formally adopted a policy towards radiation known as ALARA, ALARA, stands for as low as reasonably achievable. And the idea here is that rather than set some threshold of radiation and say that that threshold is okay, is healthy, and then we just need to get below that, or below some margin of safety. Literally, the goal of regulation is to continue to drive radiation levels down as far as can quote unquote reasonably be achieved. Regardless of whether there is, any level that we should simply consider safe. And this means, in some cases, trying to drive the radiation levels, well down below this natural background level that we're already exposed to. Part of the other, I should mention, maybe, so part of the, another part of the LNT model is that time doesn't matter. So the notion is that damage accumulates, and it just accumulates linearly over time. So say you're gonna receive a dose of radiation, right? Would you rather receive that a certain dose of radiation like all at once in a single 1 second burst, or would you rather get 1% of it every day for 100 days?
Well, according to LNT, it doesn't matter.
According to
right?
LNT, it doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? And this also, again, doesn't seem to comport with the evidence and the theory, right? So again, there's some sort of there's a mechanism of repair, and if you get hit with a whole big burst of radiation, then your body can't necessarily repair all that. But if it's a very low level spread out over a long period of time, you should be able to repair. And so this is another sort of challenge with the LNT model. Okay, so sorry, back to ALARA. So right, driving down the levels of radiation even well below kind of the background, or below any threshold that can really be demonstrated to be harmful. And because of this, at least some critics of the NRC and of Alara say that this has forced nuclear to be non-cost competitive, right? So stepping back a little bit, in the 1950s, 1960s, around then, lots of people thought that nuclear energy was absolutely the future, right? It was extremely cheap. It had no air pollution. It seemed quite abundant. It can provide base load power. There had all these great features. The energy density of the fuel is absolutely off the charts compared to any chemical fuel whatsoever. It's, I mean, roughly 100,000 to a million times more energy dense. What this means is that a nuclear plant, power plant, for instance, receives a shipment of nuclear fuel on a basis of something like once a year or even less, right? Fuel, as opposed to a fossil fuel plant, right, which is receiving them daily or weekly. Fuel becomes more like annual maintenance rather than a regular operation. And this, of course, means you need to do a lot less mining. The processing of the fuel, including processing of the waste, is just an extremely small job relative to the amount of energy produced, and so forth. In the 60s, nuclear power just seemed to have all of the all these great things going for it that was going to make it the energy of the future. People pretty much just assumed this is where things are going, and they were very optimistic about it. And what actually happened was, and nuclear energy in the U.S. at least was on an exponentially increasing path, like many new technologies. If the growth rate of the 60s and maybe even early 70s had continued, nuclear energy would be something around like 100% of electricity today in the worldwide. Instead, it leveled out in the early to mid 70s, and today provides only about 10% of worldwide electricity, 20% of the U.S. So we thought it had this tremendous potential to be the future. It ended up being 10 or 20% of the future. What went wrong? And it turns out, the proximal cause for why nuclear didn't take over all of electricity generation in the U.S. is that it's expensive. It's expensive to construct a nuclear plant. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time, and so you not only have to pay the money to build the plant, but you also have to finance it, and then that means you're paying financing costs. And in order to recoup all of those enormous upfront costs, you have to charge a higher amount for the electricity on a daily basis. As you go through the life of the plant. And so nuclear electricity is just not cost competitive with coal or natural gas plants.
But isn't the same argument can be done with wind energy? The fixed costs are pretty high, maybe not as high, but why does wind energy have a chance more so than nuclear energy? What's going on?
I don't think the fixed costs are as high,
Mm-hmm.
actually, in terms of building the upfront.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a similar pattern in that your operating costs are relatively low relative to the construction costs, but on a per megawatt of capacity
Mm-hmm.
basis, a nuclear plant is more expensive to build than pretty much anything else. I don't know how that changes, by the way. I mean, I haven't done a deep dive yet into wind and solar and so forth. So I don't know how all of that changes once you account for the extra capacity factor that you
Mm-hmm.
have to add on top of intermittent sources. And certainly, usually the numbers that you see are not taking into account if this were to be like all of our energy, how much would we need in terms of battery storage? That gets extremely expensive. So typically, when you're looking at these numbers, you have to be careful about what comparisons are being made.
Oh, that's true.
Um,
Yeah. And also the other disadvantage that nuclear is facing compared to wind and solar is that with wind and solar, we subsidize it, but with nuclear, we in fact tax it. So there is the additional regulatory burden that's placed on nuclear energy that is actually not only not placed on wind and solar, but those types of fuel sources, so to speak, get subsidized.
yeah, I haven't looked into all that, but I've heard that that's right. When you look in, to tie this all back together, right?
Mm,
When you look into, okay, well, why is it so expensive to build these, and when did it become really expensive? There's this actually fascinating historical pattern where, okay, most technologies start out expensive and then get cheaper as we get more experience with them, and as there's this thing in economics known as the learning curve or the experience curve. You can actually, if you plot cost per unit cost on the y-axis, and not time but total production volume on the x-axis, and you do that in a log plot, you will see that there's a straight line typically going down. So there's a power law where every doubling of capacity leads to a constant percentage decrease in the per unit
mhm,
costs. And this decrease is typically, I think, around 10 to 25% decrease in costs per doubling of capacity. Nuclear power was coming down the learning curve in the 60s, and it was coming down a fairly steep one in the US. I think it was around that
mhm,
25% slope. Right around 1970, this reverses. The learning curve actually inverts, and costs start going up. We're getting negative learning, right? Or sometimes called forgetting by
yeah.
doing. And it's a really perverse and very strange pattern that you don't generally see. And so what happened around 1970, give or take? Well, what happened was a rapidly escalating and highly turbulent regulatory
Mhm,
environment around nuclear. A lot of the new, regulations were getting written and rewritten, and a bunch of projects, plants that were getting built, just ran into a lot of very long delays and cost overruns. Um, there was one plant, I'm trying to remember the details of it, but in New York, that started off with an estimate of, I forget, around 5 to 7 years, and maybe $500 million, and then um, ended up getting canceled some 20 or 30 years later when it still hadn't been finished, and the estimated cost had crept up to something like $5 billion.
and that was the regulatory burden is responsible for the majority of these costs. I mean, obviously, there are the fixed costs, which are nothing to ignore.
Yeah, it's complicated. Yes, so the regulatory burden is a significant part of it. Another part of it is just political obstructionism.
Hmm.
Another part of the regulations are things that enable citizen activists, or basically anybody who opposes a project, to hold it up in hearings
Yeah.
for a very long time. And so this particular project, and I'm still blanking on the name of it, unfortunately, but it was in, if you have show notes, we can put it in the show notes later. I'll look it up for you. But it was in the New York area, and it was held up in hearings for years, and indeed, when they were ready to open the plant, they couldn't open it for, I think, a matter of years, because the local city, refused to participate in planning exercises that the NRC said were required, until and that was further obstructionism,
Mm.
until finally that requirement was simply waived. So all of these things, yeah, led to increasing costs and longer timelines, and you get these cost and schedule overruns. If you look at a plot of cost per unit capacity versus the time that the project was started, it just boom, in right around 1970, it just skyrockets, and the costs go up by multiples. And after that, pretty much no new nuclear plants were ordered since, I think, about 1974, for until almost maybe the end of the century.
Hmm.
Around then, there's been very few of them since. So it really just put a damper on this industry that was just really starting to emerge, and get going, and standardize and lower its costs, and so forth.
Yeah, Adam Thier from the Mercatus Center calls this regime Mother May I innovation instead of permissionless innovation. So there was a shift in how we tolerate risk when it comes to technology, from a common law regime where we let people innovate, and if harm takes place, then there is the court system that adjudicates harm, to a more administrative regulatory system where you have to go through all of these permissions first before you are able to innovate. And I think that is basically crippling the nuclear energy.
Yeah, and I mean, look, let's be honest, nuclear technology is, has real
Mhm.
hazards, risks, and dangers, right? We don't want to downplay that or deny it. It's very true. And precautions absolutely have to be taken. But it is possible to, it's certainly possible to not look at trade-offs,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's ultimately what has happened with nuclear regulation is that all the incentives really are on one side. So, I mean, if you think about the challenge with regulatory agencies very often is that their incentives are one-sided.
Mhm.
If anything goes wrong, they're going to be blamed for it. If anything goes right, they generally won't get the credit. And if what could go right is prevented from happening at all, that's invisible, so they
Mhm.
also don't get blamed for it,
Mhm.
right? So all of the incentives are sort of pushing in one direction, and when there's nothing to counterbalance that, then you just end up going very far away from a proper trade-off, and you end up in the side of over caution, sometimes by orders of magnitude.
So, do you see room for maybe a middle ground between administrative state regulation and common law regulation, so to speak? Do you see a middle ground there? Um, I agree with you that there are certain technologies where they have the tail risks. The percentage of something bad happening is very, 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 very small, but the face value of the harm, if it were to materialize, is extremely high. And I think it's these technologies that we're having trouble figuring out. How do we deal with those? Are we comfortable leaving them to the common law? But if the harm materializes, it's enormous. But if we go with the administrative state, then we might never give them a chance to even discover what the probabilities may be, what the face values may be.
Yeah, it's a really tough question. It's one I've been thinking about, and unfortunately, I don't have an answer. Um, but it's one that I think deserves a lot more thought, right? So I think that you don't want to simply leave it up to kind of prosecuting disasters after the fact,
Mm-hmm.
right? For a lot of reasons. First off, it means disasters happen. Second off, when you do have these tail risks, it's not even clear that even if you, okay, to take a concrete example, right? Suppose you had an unsafe nuclear plant like the one at Chernobyl, and the disaster happens. Okay, now you say, fine, under common law, we're going to hold this power company liable for all the damage they caused. They they might immediately be bankrupt, right? They might not even have what it takes to pay for that liability. Um, One mechanism you can use there is insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So insurance is a way to bring in some of the power of private markets on. So this has worked pretty well in. I'll just give an analogy to another domain rather than. I don't have a policy proposal for how to fix nuclear yet, but let me give an analogy to another domain, and I won't claim it's a perfect analogy, but maybe we can learn something from it. And that's the domain of factory safety. Um, before around the turn of the last century, there were a lot of problems in sort of new industrial factories with just there were a lot of worker injuries, right? You had this emerging, new form of the economy, which is this industrial economy. You had these large factories. You have large and powerful machines being run by new energy sources, and the whole world is in transition from this craft mode of production where you have artisans in a shop, and the artisan was generally considered to be responsible for their own safety and a responsible professional who could take care of their own safety. And now you're moving into this very different mode of
Mm-hmm.
production with hundreds or thousands of workers in a large factory. They're not all master craftsmen necessarily. And so you have there's all this new potential for accidents. And then something actually changed in the liability law, first in Europe in the late 1800s, then in the US in the early 1900s. We adopted a workers' compensation model of liability. And the key thing about this was that it was a no fault model.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than having to have a tort lawsuit where an injured worker or the family of a deceased worker would sue the company and say this was your fault, and then they'd have to argue over whose fault it was. And companies actually had a lot of ways they could get out of liability. Rather than all of that, the new liability law said, no, look, we're not going to do these court cases and so forth. If there's an accident in the factory is liable. No fault system. We're not going to, just say the factory is always liable. And further, we'll say that they are liable on a particular schedule. So we're going to state in advance. Here are a death means this many dollars paid to the family, right? If the worker goes blind, they get this many dollars, and and so forth. So there was a table of these things, and so you might have a board that would review these things to sort of determine the penalties according to the schedule, but you didn't have these lawsuits and you didn't have these fights over who was liable. What this did was it turned companies from a mode of where they were trying to avoid liability to a mode in which they were trying to prevent accidents, which was exactly kind of the mentality shift that was needed. And then they went ahead and they started to create safety engineering departments and started to analyze the root causes of accidents and collect statistics and it started to put guards on the machinery and do more regular maintenance and more training for the workers and protective equipment and so forth. And accident rates came way down. So this was a success. But one thing that happened in all of this was that companies would get liability insurance, and now the insurance companies had a particular incentive to help sort of understand the causes of accidents, and insurance companies would even do their own research on factory safety and publish things. And factories could get a discount on their insurance premiums if they followed certain best practices, right? So you can imagine, again, I don't perfectly know how well it would work, but you can imagine a similar regime for nuclear, right? Where any nuclear plant or operator would be required to have some sort of insurance, where there's some understanding of what kinds of liability would happen in certain kinds of events. And then you have, rather than, having a situation where the nuclear plant might just simply go bankrupt if there was a major disaster, they've got the insurance behind them, so they're not going to go bankrupt. The liability will be paid out. But more importantly, hopefully you were in a world where an unreliable, irresponsible nuclear operator simply could not afford the insurance, because the insurance company presumably would want to come in and do their own inspections and have their own, standard and so forth. When you have it in that regime, you have the financial incentives in both directions, which are going to be better able to balance each other and get you the right trade-off, right? So rather than the regulator with a one-sided set of incentives, you now have you have the incentives to kind of set the levels of precautions required and the number of redundant backup systems and so on and so forth. You have an incentive to set all of that at the the sort of proper economical level. It's one mechanism that might work, and I think we need a lot more thinking about types of mechanisms like that and which would help us get the right trade-offs.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. I think there's a lot of potential to this no fault regime. And I mean, the name no fault makes it sound that the factory would be at no fault, but in fact, it's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It's a strict liability regime.
Yes.
But with certain, you put money towards a pool, and that pool will automatically go to pay off claims. But the idea is that there would be none of this adjudication of how much negligence and try to avoid liabilities, etc. I think there are, I mean, in this, however many minutes we're talking, I think there is a way to regulate nuclear energy that is far superior than what we've got right now.
Yeah. I mean, but let me just say, even apart from this, I mean, I think other regulatory agencies do a better job of, I mean, this model, yeah, this model where you don't even have a threshold, right? You're not even looking at, you're not even really looking at effects on health and saying, look, that health is our ultimate goal, and safeguarding health, and literally just saying we're going to drive the radiation down as low as possible, past all thresholds. I mean, I think that's where you've gotten somewhat detached from reality, right? The FDA, and I might have a lot of criticisms of the modern FDA, but at least when they're running clinical trials, they're looking for reasonable things like safety and efficacy, right? Those are somebody would want to do those clinical trials anyway, right? Um, I think you could do better than the NRC even without having to, fundamentally transform the way it works. But I think you would have to. I think we do need a fundamental rejection of this ALARA, and I think we need to replace it with, reasonable thresholds that are based on an actual notion of what is harmful to human health.
Yeah, I mean, and once you start pushing down the exposure to below natural exposure, something terribly wrong has gone, right? This is beyond common sense.
I think so, given the data that I've seen. Yeah.
So, given the data that you've seen, nuclear energy gives the best bang for the buck, even with the safety considerations and impact on the environment.
Yeah, my understanding is that with a more reasonable regulatory environment, nuclear could be built cheap enough to be our cheapest form of electricity, right? To be cost competitive with all the others. Certainly to be cheaper than fossil fuels. And I think it's got tremendous advantages. And so I think it ought to be at least a significant part of our energy solution.
And what about its environmental impact?
There's no air pollution. There's no carbon even, right? There's no air. There's no atmospheric emissions at all. You have nuclear waste to deal with, and nuclear waste is an actual problem. But the great thing about nuclear power, again, is this insane energy density that's orders of magnitude beyond any other fuel. And what it means is that you simply don't generate a lot of waste. So we could spend a lot of money per kilogram of waste. The amount of waste that an individual American would generate over their entire lifetime, if all of their energy usage came from nuclear power, I mean, it's about this much, right? You could fit it, you could hold it in your hand. That's over your entire 80 some year lifetime. So it's just a very tiny problem, and it's solvable with technology.
So, environmental activists should be the best advocates for a switch from LNT, it seems to me. Because if we don't want fossil fuels because of its impact on the environment, then it seems to me that nuclear offers the best current alternative. And by best, I mean accounting for the cost. There are costs to every technology. So, accounting for the cost, nuclear seems to be the best option going forward. So, from an environmental activism point of view, they should be very critical of LNT because that would be the way to overcome this proportionality rule, this better be safe than sorry mentality, so we can open up the world for a nuclear future.
Yeah, and I don't know about LNT specifically, but there are definitely people who would consider themselves environmentalists who are strongly pro-nuclear as an important path forward. The folks at the Breakthrough Institute, who I think coined the term eco-modernism, have done actually a lot of really good research on nuclear power. They've got some interesting reports that I recommend checking out. One was called How to Make Nuclear Cheap, and another was called How to Make Nuclear Innovative. They've written a bunch about it over the years. Stuart Brand, in his relatively recent book, Whole Earth Discipline, holds up nuclear power as one of the key, technologies for the future. And I think Brand also, considers himself an environmentalist. Brand says that there is kind of a split between the scientific and the romantic wings of the environmentalist movement, right? That the folks who are looking at the science are actually for some things that seem counterintuitive to some of the environmentalist mentality. In his book, nuclear power is one of them. Dense urban living in cities is another one. And I don't remember some of the other things that he mentions, but versus the romantic environmentalists who are going a little bit more on a feeling or on sort of older ideas, and have this knee jerk reaction against nuclear and other technologies.
We will link to all of these books and articles that Jason is talking about. And also, I would love to link to your bicycle article that became a hit and the talk that you gave on last year, was it, at the Salem Center,
Yeah,
where
November.
you unpacked the mystery of nuclear energy, because I think this is very important. You talk about the incentives for the nuclear agencies, that if they do it wrong, they get blamed. If they do it right, they never get rewarded. But I think that incentive structure, we set up that incentive structure. And the fact that we don't have as much education in what this technology, what this magic is, contributes to us putting pressures on the regulators to go for this, well, better be safe than sorry. Better be safe than sorry in the eyes of whom? In the eyes of all of the taxpayers that are holding you accountable for if you get it wrong, but never giving you an upside. It's like a kicker in a football game. And we will link to that as well, where Jason unpacks the mysteries of nuclear energy. And with that, do you have any last words you would like to tell us?
I do think it is important more broadly for people to understand not just nuclear energy, but in general, all of the technologies that make up the modern world and give us our standard of living. I've called this industrial literacy. I think just as people sometimes say that you should know where your food comes from. I think you should really know where your food comes from, and that includes understanding why it's important that we have mechanized agriculture and synthetic fertilizers and irrigation and all the other things that we have. You should also know where your clothes come from, where your paved roads come from, where your central heating and air conditioning comes from. You should have some basic understanding of the technologies that underpin the amazing world that we live in and the comfort and safety and health and freedoms and choices and opportunities that we all enjoy, living in modern industrial civilization. I think, too many people enjoy all of the fruits of industrial civilization and have no idea what really makes it possible. And then we all go out and debate industrial policy and vote for politicians who are going to be in control of industrial policy and, without a very basic understanding of what that actually is and how it works. So I think everybody should learn a little bit more about just what makes the modern world possible.
Thank you very much, Jason. This talk was made possible by the science of technological progress. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.